London, England. The year is 1658. Robert Hooke sits in a cramped room at Oxford, bent over a workbench cluttered with metal wire, tools, and half-finished contraptions. He's 23 years old, brilliant but poor, working as an assistant to the chemist Robert Boyle. His health has always been delicate. He's slight, often sick, perpetually exhausted, but his mind never rests. Tonight, he's thinking about clocks, specifically about the problem of keeping time at sea. England is a maritime nation. Ships carry trade, wealth, and power across the oceans. But navigation is imprecise, deadly so. Sailors can determine latitude easily enough by observing the sun and stars. But longitude, how far east or west you've traveled, requires knowing the exact time. And no clock yet invented can keep accurate time on a rolling, pitching ship. Pendulum clocks, the most accurate timekeepers of the age, are useless at sea. They depend on gravity pulling the pendulum in a consistent direction. On a ship, gravity's pull is constantly changing relative to the clock. The pendulum swings erratically. Time drifts. Hooke stares at a coil of wire on his bench. He's been experimenting with springs, thin strips and coils of metal that compress and expand, storing and releasing energy. What if, he wonders, you could use a spring instead of a pendulum? What if a spring could regulate the oscillation of a balance wheel, creating regular measurable beats regardless of the clock's orientation? He picks up the wire and begins to wind it into a tight spiral. His hands are skilled. He's been building instruments since childhood, when illness kept him home from school and he filled the hours making mechanical toys. He attaches one end of the spiral spring to a small wheel, the other to a fixed point. He releases it. The wheel turns, the spring coils tighter, then uncoils, turning the wheel back. It oscillates, back and forth, back and forth, regular as a heartbeat. Hooke allows himself a rare smile. This could work. This could change everything. What he doesn't know yet is that this spring, this simple coil of metal wire, will do far more than solve navigation. It will become the heartbeat of the industrial age. It will make portable timepieces possible for the first time in human history. It will absorb the shocks of trains and automobiles, enable firearms to fire, allow pens to click, sofas to cushion, doors to close, trampolines to bounce. The spring is everywhere, invisible, essential. And its story, a story of energy stored and released, of elasticity and resilience, begins thousands of years before Hooke's workshop, in a time when humans first bent wood and sinew into shapes that would snap back with deadly force. This is the story of the spring, not the story of one inventor, but of a principle discovered and rediscovered across millennia, refined through genius and necessity, until it became one of the foundations of modern life. And at the center of that story stands a man who never got the credit he deserved, who fought bitter battles for recognition, who understood springs better than anyone before him, but died largely forgotten. Robert Hooke discovered the law that governs every spring that's ever been made, and then he spent decades watching others claim his ideas as their own. Before there were metal springs, there were natural springs, not the kind that store energy, but the kind our ancestors recognized in the world around them. The most ancient spring is the bow, dating back at least 64,000 years, possibly longer. The bow is humanity's first practical application of elastic energy storage. The principle is simple. Bend a flexible branch or piece of wood. Hold it in that bent position with a string, and when you release the string, the wood springs back, converting the energy you stored by bending it into the kinetic energy of an arrow. This is the essence of what a spring does. It stores mechanical energy when deformed, compressed, stretched, or twisted, and releases that energy when allowed to return to its original shape. For tens of thousands of years, humans used this principle with natural materials, wood for bows, sinew, and gut for bowstrings. Later, as metallurgy developed, bronze and iron. But always the same idea: deform something elastic, store energy, release it suddenly for useful work. The ancient Egyptians, around 1300 BCE, used leaf springs, flat curved pieces of metal or wood, as primitive shock absorbers for chariots. The springs flexed as the chariot bounced over rough ground, making the ride slightly less bone-rattling for the occupants. It wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. The Romans, master engineers, also used leaf springs for their two-wheeled vehicles. They understood that flexibility could be useful, that materials which bent without breaking could improve comfort and performance. But these weren't coiled springs. They weren't torsion springs. They were just bent pieces of flexible material, and their behavior wasn't particularly well understood or controlled. The real breakthrough came in the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria with a man named Ctesibius. Ctesibius was the son of a barber. Legend has it that while working in his father's shop, he devised an adjustable mirror, a mirror mounted on a rod with a lead counterweight running through a tube. When the mirror was moved up or down, the counterweight moved in the opposite direction through the tube. As it moved, it compressed the air trapped in the tube, which then escaped with a whistling sound. That sound fascinated Ctesibius. It was the sound of air, behaving like a spring, compressing, storing energy, then releasing it. He realized that air itself was elastic, that it could be compressed and would push back with a force proportional to how much you compressed it. This insight, that materials could store energy elastically, led Ctesibius to invent compressed air devices. He built pumps, water organs, even air-powered catapults. But more importantly for our story, he developed bronze springs. Ctesibius discovered that bronze could be made more elastic by alloying it with extra tin and then hammering it after casting. This created bronze that could be bent or twisted and would spring back to its original shape with considerable force. He used these bronze springs in catapults, creating weapons that could store more energy and launch projectiles farther than rope-twisted devices. Ctesibius's bronze springs were real metal springs, the first we have clear historical evidence for. They weren't coiled, but they were deliberate applications of metallic elasticity for mechanical purposes. His work was revolutionary, but like so much ancient knowledge, it was poorly preserved. Ctesibius wrote treatises, but none survived. We know about him only through later writers who referenced his work: Vitruvius, hero of Alexandria, Philo of Byzantium. And while bronze springs continued to be used in some applications, the broader principles Ctesibius discovered were lost or forgotten in the chaos following Rome's fall. For nearly 1,000 years, spring technology stagnated in Europe. Simple springs appeared in door locks and primitive mechanisms, but nothing sophisticated, nothing that showed deep understanding of elastic principles. That understanding would have to be rediscovered, and it would take a sickly English boy with clever hands and an insatiable curiosity to do it. Robert Hooke was born on July 18, 1635, on the Isle of Wight, a small island off England's southern coast. His father, John Hooke, was a curate, essentially an assistant minister, at the local church. The family wasn't wealthy, but they were respectable. Robert was the youngest of 4 children, and from the start, he was frail. He suffered from terrible headaches, digestive problems, and general weakness. Most of his childhood was spent at home rather than at school. His parents worried he wouldn't survive to adulthood. But young Robert's mind was sharp. Unable to attend school regularly, he taught himself by reading everything he could find and by taking things apart to see how they worked. He was fascinated by mechanical devices. He built model ships, made sundials, constructed a working wooden clock. His father noticed that Robert had an extraordinary talent for intricate work, for understanding how pieces fit together. When Robert was 13, his father died, leaving him £40, a decent sum, but not enough to live on indefinitely. The boy was sent to London to apprentice with a painter, but he quickly realized that painting wasn't his calling. Instead, he enrolled at Westminster School, where the headmaster, Dr. Busby, recognized Hooke's unusual abilities and allowed him to study largely on his own. Hooke devoured knowledge. He learned Latin and Greek. He studied geometry and discovered he could visualize complex spatial relationships with ease. He taught himself to play the organ. But always, his real love was mechanics, understanding how things moved, how forces were transmitted, how energy could be stored and released. In 1653, at age 18, Hooke entered Christ Church, Oxford. This was extraordinarily fortunate timing. Oxford in the 1650s was a hub of scientific activity. A group of natural philosophers, what we'd call scientists today, met regularly to discuss experiments and theories. They called themselves the Invisible College, or the Philosophical College. Among them were some of the greatest minds of the age: Robert Boyle, Christopher Wren, John Wallis, Seth Ward. Hooke, poor and unknown, made himself useful to these gentlemen scholars. He had a skill they lacked. He could design and build the apparatus needed for experiments. His hands could create what their minds conceived. In 1655, Robert Boyle hired Hooke as his assistant. Boyle wanted to build an air pump to investigate the properties of gases, but such devices were notoriously difficult to construct. Hooke threw himself into the project. He designed and built what was essentially the first practical air pump in England, a device that could create a vacuum strong enough for meaningful experiments. Working with Boyle, Hooke learned systematic experimentation, but his mind was already racing ahead, thinking about other problems, and one problem in particular captured his imagination: how to build a clock that could keep accurate time at sea. Around 1658, Hooke began experimenting with springs as regulators for timepieces. The idea wasn't entirely new. Others had thought about using springs in clocks, but no one had solved the engineering challenges. Hooke approached it systematically, testing different materials, different configurations, different attachment methods. By 1660, he had made 2 crucial inventions. First, the balance spring, a thin, spiraling strip of metal attached to a balance wheel. As the wheel rotated one direction, the spring would coil tighter, storing energy. When released, the spring would uncoil, turning the wheel back the other direction. The spring created a regular oscillation, just like a pendulum, but independent of gravity's direction. Second, the anchor escapement, an improved mechanism for translating the oscillation of the balance wheel into the measured advance of the clock's gears. This was a major improvement over earlier escapements, reducing friction and improving timekeeping accuracy. These inventions should have made Hooke rich. His backers, including Christopher Wren and other prominent members of the Royal Society, encouraged him, to patent the design. A patent was drawn up, but then Hooke made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. He realized that under the terms of the patent, anyone who improved his design would receive the royalties, not him. He refused to sign. He wanted credit and compensation for his work, but he also wanted control over improvements. The patent was never filed. Hooke continued working on his spring-regulated clocks, but he never commercialized them. He kept the designs largely secret, demonstrating them occasionally, but not publishing the details. This was the first of many bitter disputes over priority and credit that would define Hooke's career. He was brilliant, he was right, but he was also prickly, defensive, and often too protective of his ideas. It would cost him dearly. In 1660, the same year Hooke invented his balance spring, something else happened. He discovered what would later be called Hooke's law. While working on springs for clocks, Hooke realized something fundamental about how springs behave. He noticed that if you pulled on a spring to stretch it or pushed on it to compress it, the force required was proportional to the distance you stretched or compressed it. Double the displacement, double the force. Triple the displacement, triple the force. It was a perfectly linear relationship, at least within the spring's elastic limit, the point beyond which the spring would be permanently deformed. This was a profound insight. It meant springs were predictable. If you knew the spring's properties, you could calculate exactly how much force it would exert at any given compression or extension. This made springs useful not just for storing energy, but for measuring force. Hooke understood the implications immediately. Springs could be used in scientific instruments to measure weight, pressure, tension. They could be precisely calibrated. They could become tools for quantifying the world. But Hooke didn't publish this discovery, not yet. He kept working with springs, applying his understanding to more clock designs, to instrument designs, to architectural problems. He mentioned it to colleagues occasionally, demonstrated it in lectures at the Royal Society. In 1662, Hooke was appointed Curator of Experiments for the newly formed Royal Society of London. This was the perfect position for him. He was responsible for demonstrating new experiments at the Society's weekly meetings. Week after week, he would design and perform experiments exploring natural philosophy. It was exhausting, demanding work. The Society paid poorly, but it put Hooke at the center of English scientific life. In 1665, at age 30, Hooke published Micrographia, a book about his observations through microscopes. It was a sensation, the first scientific bestseller. The book showcased Hooke's many talents, his skill with instruments, his ability to draw what he observed, his insights into natural phenomena. One of his observations would make him famous. Examining a thin slice of cork, he noticed it was composed of tiny, box-like compartments, which he called cells, the first use of that term in biology. Micrographia made Hooke well known, but it also made him enemies. Success bred jealousy, especially among those who felt their own work wasn't receiving sufficient attention. Meanwhile, Hooke continued working on springs, but he still didn't publish his law of elasticity. He was paranoid about idea theft, and with some justification. Priority disputes were common in this era, and losing credit for a discovery could mean losing income and reputation. In 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed much of the city. Hooke, along with Christopher Wren, was appointed as a surveyor to help rebuild. This work was lucrative, finally giving Hooke financial security, but it also consumed enormous amounts of his time and energy. All the while, He continued experimenting with springs, refining his understanding, keeping notes, but not publishing. Then, in the 1670s, disaster struck. A Dutch scientist named Christian Huygens announced that he had invented a balance spring for watches, the exact device Hooke had invented over a decade earlier and had been demonstrating privately to colleagues. Hooke was furious. He claimed priority. He produced witnesses who had seen his demonstrations. He argued vehemently that Huygens had stolen his idea. Huygens, for his part, claimed independent invention, and perhaps he had invented it independently. Such things happen in science. But Hooke had been there first, had been working on the problem longer, had understood the principles more deeply. The dispute grew bitter. Hooke's reputation suffered. People began to see him as quarrelsome, as too quick to claim credit. Never mind that his claims were usually justified. Finally, in 1678, 18 years after his initial discovery, Hooke published his law of elasticity in a lecture titled De Potentia Restitutiva, or of spring. He announced the law in the form of an anagram, chi nostuv. When decoded, it revealed utensio sic vis as the extension, so the force. Hooke's law, as it would come to be known, states that the force a spring exerts is proportional to its displacement from equilibrium. Mathematically, F equals negative kx, where F is force, x is displacement, and k is the spring constant, a measure of the spring's stiffness. This simple equation has been used to design springs for over 300 years. It's taught in physics classes worldwide. It's the foundation for understanding elastic materials. It's one of the most important principles in mechanics. But because Hooke waited so long to publish it, because he had made enemies with his priority disputes, he never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. While Hooke was fighting for credit, the world was beginning to realize just how useful springs could be. The late 17th and early 18th centuries saw an explosion in clock and watchmaking. Spring-powered pocket watches, made possible by balanced springs, became luxury items, then common items. By 1700, a gentleman could carry accurate time in his waistcoat pocket, something that would have seemed like magic a century earlier. But springs were finding other applications too. In 1763, an English inventor named Richard Tradwell patented the first coil spring designed specifically for vehicle suspension. Before this, carriages used leaf springs, stacked layers of curved metal strips that flexed to absorb shocks. But Tradwell realized that a helical coil spring, wire wound into a spiral, could store more energy in less space and provide more consistent cushioning. His patent, Great Britain Patent 792, was titled Springs for Carriages. It described a helical suspension system that could make carriage rides dramatically more comfortable. The innovation was revolutionary. Within decades, coil springs were being used in carriages throughout Europe and America. The principle was simple but elegant. As the carriage wheel hit a bump, the spring compressed, storing the energy of the impact. As the spring expanded again, it released that energy gradually, cushioning the passengers from the shock. The same compression and expansion that Hooke had analyzed mathematically was now making transportation more bearable. In 1857, the steel coil spring was patented in America. Steel springs were stronger and more durable than earlier iron springs. They could handle heavier loads and last longer. The patent was for use in chair seats, but the applications quickly multiplied. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and springs went from useful to essential. The 19th century transformed springs from specialized components into mass-produced necessities. Railroads needed springs. Every railroad car required suspension systems to absorb the constant vibration and shock of travel over rails. Thousands upon thousands of springs were needed as rail networks expanded across continents. Heavy-duty compression springs supported the weight of freight cars. Softer springs cushioned passenger cars, making rail travel comfortable enough for long journeys. The springs in railroad cars had to be precisely engineered. Too soft, and the car would sway dangerously. Too stiff, and passengers would feel every bump. Engineers learned to calculate spring constants, to design springs that would compress exactly the right amount under expected loads. They were applying Hooke's law, even if they didn't always realize it. Factory machinery needed springs. As steam power was harnessed to drive industrial equipment, springs became essential components in countless machines. Springs absorbed shocks, maintained tension in belts and chains, provided consistent pressure in pressing and stamping operations, returned levers and mechanisms to their starting positions. Door locks needed springs. As buildings grew larger and security more important, spring-loaded locks became standard. The springs held lock mechanisms in position, kept doors closed, allowed keys to work smoothly. Firearms needed springs. The flintlock mechanism that dominated the 18th century relied on a spring to strike the flint against steel, creating the spark that ignited gunpowder. Later firearms, percussion caps, then cartridge-based guns, all used springs to strike primers. The reliable, instant release of stored energy that springs provided made modern firearms possible. Even furniture needed springs. In 1871, a German inventor named Heinrich Westphal placed coiled springs inside a mattress, creating the inner spring mattress. This transformed sleep comfort, distributing weight more evenly and lasting longer than earlier stuffed mattresses. Within decades, spring mattresses were everywhere. The industrial demand for springs drove innovations in manufacturing. Making a good spring by hand was difficult, time-consuming, and inconsistent. But as the 19th century progressed, machines were developed to make springs. Spring coiling machines, invented in the 1850s and 1860s, could wind wire into coils automatically. The machines used gears, remember gears, to feed wire at a controlled rate while rotating a mandrel to form the coil. This allowed springs to be mass-produced with consistent properties. Heat treatment processes improved spring steel. Heating steel to specific temperatures and then cooling it in controlled ways could increase its elasticity and strength, allowing springs to store more energy and resist fatigue longer. Testing equipment was developed to measure spring constants and verify that manufactured springs met specifications. You could compress a spring a known amount, measure the force required, and calculate whether the spring's constant matched the design. All of this, the manufacturing, the testing, the design calculations, rested on Hooke's law. Every engineer designing springs was using the principle that Hooke had discovered in 1660 and published in 1678. Force is proportional to displacement. Hooke himself never saw this industrial revolution. He died in 1703, age 67, largely forgotten by the scientific establishment that had once celebrated his work. He was bitter, isolated, his many contributions overshadowed by priority disputes and arguments with more famous colleagues, particularly Isaac Newton, who became president of the Royal Society after Hooke's death and systematically marginalized his predecessor's legacy. But the principle Hooke discovered lived on, and as the industrial age matured, springs became more essential, not less. The 20th century was spring's golden age. The automobile industry, more than anything else, demonstrated just how critical springs had become. Early cars in the 1890s and early 1900s had primitive suspension systems, often just solid axles with minimal cushioning. Riding in these vehicles over rough roads was brutal. You felt every bump, every pothole, every rut. Cars couldn't go very fast because the ride became unbearable. But as automotive engineering advanced, sophisticated spring suspension systems emerged. Coil springs and leaf springs were mounted between the car's frame and its axles, absorbing road shocks and keeping the wheels in contact with the ground. This improved both comfort and handling. Cars could travel faster on poor roads because the springs prevented the vehicle from bouncing dangerously. By the 1920s and 30s, spring design had become a specialized engineering discipline within the automotive industry. Engineers calculated optimal spring rates for different vehicle weights and purposes. Racing cars use stiff springs for precise handling. Luxury cars use softer springs for comfort. Trucks used heavy-duty springs to carry loads. The development of shock absorbers, hydraulic dampers that worked alongside springs, further improved suspension. The spring absorbed the energy of a bump by compressing. The shock absorber prevented the spring from bouncing back too quickly, dissipating excess energy and smoothing the ride. Modern cars can have over 50 different springs scattered throughout the vehicle. Springs in the suspension, obviously, but also springs in the engine valves that control combustion timing. Springs in the clutch that engage and disengage power transmission. Springs in door handles, trunk latches, hood releases. Springs in seats for comfort. Springs in seatbelt retractors that keep belts snug. Springs in fuel injectors, in brake mechanisms, in steering columns. Each of these springs is precisely engineered using Hooke's law. Each has a carefully calculated spring constant appropriate to its function. Each represents centuries of accumulated knowledge about elastic materials. Aircraft needed even more sophisticated springs. Landing gear springs had to absorb the tremendous impact of a multi-ton vehicle hitting the runway at high speed. These springs used exotic materials, special steel alloys, titanium, composite materials, engineered to store massive amounts of energy without failing. Aerospace engineers also developed new types of springs: Belleville washers, wave springs, die springs, gas springs. Each type had advantages for specific applications. Everyday objects became filled with springs. Ballpoint pens used tiny springs to retract the tip. Staplers used springs to push the next staple into position and to provide the force for stapling. Clipboards, clothespins, mousetraps, toys, tools. Springs were everywhere, so common we stopped noticing them. Entertainment devices relied on springs. The slinky, invented in 1943, was just a large helical spring that could walk downstairs, converting gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy through its springiness. It became one of the most popular toys of the 20th century. Trampolines used dozens of springs around their perimeter to make the jumping surface elastic and bouncy, allowing gymnasts and children to leap improbably high. Pogo sticks used a central spring to store energy during the downward compression and release it during the upward bounce, creating a simple but addictive toy. Medical devices incorporated springs for everything from surgical instruments to hospital beds to implantable devices. Springs provided the precise, repeatable forces needed for medical applications. Electronics used springs as contact points in switches, in battery compartments, in circuit board connections. Tiny springs ensured electrical contact even as devices were moved or vibrated. By the late 20th century, springs were being manufactured by the millions, hundreds of millions, every year. They ranged from microscopic springs in watches, barely visible to the naked eye, to massive industrial springs in heavy machinery weighing hundreds of pounds. Computer-controlled machines could now manufacture springs to tolerances measured in micrometers. Computer simulations could predict spring behavior under complex loading conditions. Advanced materials science created springs that could operate at extreme temperatures, resist corrosion, withstand millions of compression cycles without failure. And every single spring, from the smallest to the largest, from the simplest to the most exotic, obeyed Hooke's law. The principle that Robert Hooke discovered in a cramped Oxford workshop in 1660, published in an anagram in 1678, and spent decades defending from those who would claim credit for it, that principle governs them all. Let's take a moment to understand why springs are so important, why they've become so ubiquitous in modern technology. At their most basic, springs store energy, but they do it in a special way, elastically. When you compress a spring, you do work on it. You transfer energy into it. That energy is stored in the deformation of the metal. It hasn't been converted to heat, or very little has. It's just stored, waiting. When you release the spring, all that energy comes back out. The spring expands, doing work on whatever it's pushing against. It's an energy storage system with very little loss. This makes springs incredibly useful for buffering and smoothing forces. A sudden impact, a car hitting a pothole, a hammer striking a surface, creates a spike of force that happens very quickly. If transmitted directly, this force can damage things. But if you put a spring in between, the spring compresses, absorbing the energy of the impact over time. Then it releases that energy back more slowly, spreading the force out over a longer period. The peak force is much lower, preventing damage. Springs are also useful for maintaining force. If you need something to be pressed together with a specific force, you can use a spring. The spring will compress to exactly the point where its restoring force matches the required force, and it will maintain that force automatically. No power source needed, no control system, just the simple mechanics of elastic deformation. Springs provide return force for mechanisms. Push a button, and a spring pushes it back out. Pull a trigger, and a spring returns it to the starting position. This makes mechanisms repeatable and reliable. They always return to the same state. Springs can measure force. Because Hooke's law gives a linear relationship between force and displacement, if you know a spring's constant, you can use it as a force gauge. Hang a weight from a spring, measure how far it stretches, and you can calculate the weight. This principle is used in everything from kitchen scales to industrial load cells. Springs can isolate vibrations. Mounted between a vibrating component and a sensitive component, springs absorb vibrations, preventing them from transmitting. This is why engines are mounted on springs, why washing machines have spring suspension, why delicate instruments are mounted on spring isolators. The beauty of springs is their simplicity. No electronics, no hydraulics, no complex mechanisms. Just a piece of metal shaped correctly, behaving according to fundamental physical principles. They work forever, or until they fatigue. They require no maintenance, they're cheap to manufacture, and they're extraordinarily reliable. This is why springs are in everything. Once you understand elastic energy storage, once you understand Hooke's law, you see applications everywhere. Every time you need to store energy, absorb a shock, maintain pressure, provide return force, or isolate vibration, a spring is often the simplest solution. Robert Hooke never lived to see springs become so essential. He died on March 3rd, 1703, at his rooms in Gresham College, London. He had never married, though his niece Grace had lived with him and been his companion until her death in 1687, which left him devastated. His later years were marked by increasing isolation and bitterness. When Hooke died, the Royal Society, the institution he had served for over 40 years, performing hundreds of experiments, demonstrating countless instruments, contributing ideas to virtually every area of natural philosophy, took almost no notice. The man who had invented the balance spring, discovered the law of elasticity, coined the term cell, contributed to architecture, astronomy, microscopy, paleontology, and a dozen other fields, was forgotten within a generation. Part of this was Isaac Newton's doing. Newton, who became president of the Royal Society shortly after Hooke's death, actively worked to erase Hooke's legacy. The two had been bitter enemies, fighting over priority for theories about planetary motion and the nature of light. Newton removed Hooke's portrait from the Royal Society. He minimized Hooke's contributions in his own writings. For over 2 centuries, Hooke existed more as a footnote than as a major figure. But Hooke's law survived. Engineers and scientists couldn't ignore it. It was too useful, too fundamental. The principle that elastic force is proportional to displacement was rediscovered by every generation of people working with springs. In the late 20th century, historians of science began to recognize Hooke's true importance. As they studied the development of experimental science, they realized that Hooke had been absolutely central to the scientific revolution. He had pioneered the use of instruments in scientific investigation. He had championed empirical testing over pure theory. He had demonstrated that careful, systematic experimentation could reveal nature's laws. Today, Hooke is finally receiving recognition as one of the greatest experimental scientists of the 17th century, perhaps of any century. A plaque in Westminster Abbey now commemorates him. Universities teach Hooke's law in introductory physics. Engineers designing springs calculate spring constants and apply force equations that derive directly from Hooke's work. And springs themselves, they're more ubiquitous than ever. Let's look at some specific examples of how springs shape modern life, often invisibly. Your car. The suspension system, probably coil springs or leaf springs on each wheel, absorbs thousands of bumps per mile, keeping the ride smooth and the tires in contact with the road. Without springs, driving would be slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous. The engine contains dozens of springs in valve systems, maintaining precise timing for combustion. The clutch uses a spring to maintain pressure on the friction disc. Even your seat uses springs to cushion you. Your mattress. If it's an inner spring mattress, it contains hundreds of coil springs, each supporting part of your body weight and conforming to your shape. These springs distribute your weight evenly, preventing pressure points that would wake you up. You spend a third of your life supported by springs. Your office chair. Multiple springs, a gas spring in the height adjustment mechanism, providing lift and smooth height changes. Torsion springs in the recline mechanism, allowing the backrest to tilt. Possibly a spring in the seat cushion for additional comfort. Every adjustment, every movement, springs are making it smooth and controlled. Your garage door. One of the most dangerous springs in your home. The torsion spring that counterbalances the door's weight. This spring is under enormous tension, storing enough energy to lift a 150-pound door. When properly adjusted, it makes the door feel almost weightless. If it breaks, it can cause serious injury, which is why garage door spring replacement is a job for professionals. Your phone. Tiny springs in the power button, volume buttons, silent switch, springs maintaining pressure on electrical contacts, a vibration motor that uses springs to convert rotational motion into vibrations for alerts. Springs so small they're difficult to see without magnification, yet essential for the device to function. Medical devices, springs in syringes providing consistent pressure for drug delivery. Springs in surgical instruments maintaining precise grip force. Springs in hospital beds allowing position adjustments. Springs in prosthetic devices providing natural joint motion. In every case, the spring provides reliable, repeatable force without needing power or control systems. Railroad systems. Every railroad car rides on springs, often massive coil springs that can be 2 feet in diameter and weigh hundreds of pounds each. These springs must support tons of weight while providing a smooth ride. They must withstand millions of compression cycles over decades. They must work reliably in extreme heat and cold. Modern rail springs are engineering marvels, precisely calculated using Hooke's law and advanced materials science. Industrial machinery, springs in punch presses providing return force for the ram. Springs in conveyor systems maintaining belt tension. Springs in robotic systems, cushioning joints and providing compliance. Springs in assembly machines, holding parts in position. In manufacturing, springs are as essential as motors and gears. The simple trampoline. The springs around a trampoline's perimeter, typically 72 to 96 of them, convert your downward kinetic energy into elastic potential energy stored in the springs, which then releases as you bounce upward. The springs must all have similar spring constants so the mat deflects evenly. Replace just a few springs with stiffer or softer ones and the trampoline becomes unsafe because the jumping surface won't deform uniformly. Everyday consumer products. The click mechanism in a ballpoint pen, a small spring and cam system that retracts and extends the tip. The stapler on your desk, a spring pushing the staple strip forward, another spring providing the force that drives the staple through paper. Your clipboards, your binder clips, your clothespins all use springs to provide clamping force. Musical instruments. Piano keys return to their resting position thanks to springs. Guitar strings are springs, taut wires that vibrate when plucked, storing and releasing energy as standing waves. The valves on brass instruments use springs to return to the closed position after being pressed. Even electric guitars rely on springs in the tremolo system that changes string tension for vibrato effects. Every one of these applications, from the massive to the microscopic, from the critical to the trivial, relies on the same fundamental principle that Robert Hooke discovered while trying to build a better clock. Force is proportional to displacement. Energy is stored elastically. A spring compressed is energy waiting to be released. Let's return to Hooke one more time to understand what drove him, what frustrated him, and what he left behind. One autumn evening in 1671, Hooke sat in his rooms at Gresham College, writing in his diary. He was 36 years old, already recognized as one of England's leading experimental scientists, yet he felt constantly besieged. He wrote about his health complaints, his sleepless nights, his worries about money. He wrote about the experiments he was conducting, the instruments he was building, the ideas crowding his mind. But mostly, he wrote about disputes, about who saw what first, who demonstrated what when, who deserved credit for which idea. These concerns consumed him, ate at him, prevented him from enjoying his considerable achievements. It's easy to judge Hooke harshly for this obsession with priority. Why couldn't he just be satisfied with his work? Why did he need constant recognition? But consider his position. He wasn't independently wealthy like many members of the Royal Society. He depended on income from his work. In an age before patents offered real protection, before scientific publishing was formalized, the only thing that guaranteed compensation was being recognized as the originator of an idea. If someone else claimed credit for your invention, you lost not just recognition, but potential income. Moreover, Hooke was right. In many of his disputes, he genuinely had been first. He had invented the balance spring before Huygens. He had proposed versions of the inverse square law before Newton. He had made observations and measurements that others later claimed as their own. His defensiveness came from justified frustration. And there was something else. Hooke believed deeply that experimental science, hands-on investigation using instruments, was the path to understanding nature. He spent his life building devices, performing experiments, measuring, and quantifying. He believed that ideas had value, but only when tested against reality. This put him at odds with more theoretically minded philosophers like Newton, who preferred mathematical reasoning to experimental demonstration. The conflict between Hooke and Newton wasn't just personal rivalry. It represented two different approaches to science. Hooke's approach, emphasizing instruments and empirical testing, would eventually win out. Modern science is fundamentally experimental. But in the 17th century, theoretical natural philosophy still commanded more prestige. Hooke also understood something that many of his contemporaries missed: the importance of standardization and precision. His work on springs taught him that exact measurements matter, that consistent materials matter, that understanding quantitative relationships is essential to engineering. When Hooke designed his balance spring, he didn't just make it work, he made it repeatable. He specified the materials, the dimensions, the attachment methods. He understood that for a technology to be useful, it had to be manufacturable by others to consistent standards. This attention to precision and standardization was revolutionary. It's what separates modern engineering from earlier craft traditions, and it's what makes Hooke's law so powerful. It's not just a description of how springs behave, it's a quantitative relationship that allows springs to be designed and manufactured to precise specifications. The story of springs doesn't end with Hooke, of course. The 18th and 19th centuries saw continual refinement of spring technology. The 20th century brought materials science and manufacturing techniques that Hooke couldn't have imagined. But every advance built on the foundation he laid. Engineers today still start with Hooke's law when designing springs. They still calculate spring constants, still measure force displacement relationships, still think about elastic energy storage in fundamentally the same way Hooke did. Modern springs use materials he never knew existed: titanium alloys, nickel superalloys, composite materials with tailored elastic properties. Computer simulations can predict spring behavior under complex loading conditions with extraordinary accuracy. Manufacturing techniques can produce springs with tolerances measured in millionths of an inch. And yet the physics hasn't changed. A spring still stores energy elastically. Force is still proportional to displacement. The fundamental principle Hooke discovered in 1660 still governs every spring ever made. There's something profound in this. 3.5 centuries ago, a sickly English scientist working alone in a cramped workshop identified a fundamental law of nature. He didn't have advanced instruments. He didn't have computers or sophisticated materials. He had metal wire, careful observation, and a brilliant mind. And what he discovered was so fundamental, so deeply rooted in the nature of elastic materials, that it remains exactly as true today as it was then. Physics doesn't change. The laws Hooke uncovered weren't invented, they were discovered. They existed before humans, they'll exist after humans. Hooke simply had the genius to recognize them, measure them, and express them mathematically. This is the power of science. Not to create truth, but to reveal it. To find the patterns underlying nature's complexity. To express those patterns in ways that allow us to predict, to design, to build. Hooke did this for springs, and in doing so, he enabled everything that came after. Every automobile suspension, every mattress spring, every ballpoint pen, every medical device. They all exist because Hooke revealed the law that governs elastic deformation. There's a particular irony in Hooke's story. He spent so much of his life fighting for credit, defending his priority, ensuring he was recognized as the inventor of various devices and discoverer of various principles. It consumed him, embittered him, probably shortened his life. And then after his death, he was largely forgotten anyway, not because his work lacked merit, but because he made powerful enemies and lacked powerful advocates. For 2 centuries, Hooke was a footnote in the history of science. Newton's shadow covered him completely. The Royal Society that he served for 40 years barely mentioned him after his death. But here's the irony. Hooke's work survived even when his name faded. Every engineer calculating spring constants was using Hooke's law, whether they knew who Hooke was or not. Every watchmaker installing balance springs was using Hooke's invention, whether they attributed it to him or not. His ideas outlived his reputation. The principles he discovered were too useful, too fundamental, to be forgotten even when the man himself was. And eventually, inevitably, historians rediscovered Hooke. As they studied the scientific revolution more carefully, they realized that this man, who had been dismissed as a quarrelsome assistant, was actually one of the giants of the 17th century science. His experimental methods, his instrumental innovations, his theoretical insights, they were all crucial to the development of modern science. Today, Hooke is finally receiving his due. Not universal recognition, perhaps, he'll never be as famous as Newton, but acknowledgement from those who understand the history of science that he was absolutely essential. And Hooke's law? It's taught in every introductory physics course worldwide. Millions of students learn it every year. It's one of the most widely known principles in all of physics. The formula F equals negative kx is elegant, simple, and universally applicable. It describes springs, obviously, but also any system that exhibits linear restoring force. It's fundamental to understanding harmonic motion, wave propagation, molecular bonds, acoustic resonance. Hooke would have appreciated this, I think. Not universal fame, but his law recognized as fundamental. His name attached to a principle that will be taught as long as physics is studied. His discovery living on long after the priority disputes that tormented him have been forgotten. Let's pull back now and see the full arc of the spring's story. Humans have been using elastic materials for over 60,000 years, since the first bow was bent and released to send an arrow flying. For most of that time, the use was empirical, intuitive. Wood bent, sinews stretched, and skilled craftsmen learned through experience how to make these materials work. Ctesibius, in the 3rd century BCE, began to understand elasticity systematically. He realized that materials could store energy, that compression created pressure, that bronze could be made springier, but his knowledge was lost when the ancient world collapsed. For over a millennium, spring technology barely advanced. Simple springs in locks, in some mechanisms, but nothing sophisticated. Then Hooke, in the 17th century, rediscovered the principles. More than rediscovered, he quantified them. He measured the relationship between force and displacement. He expressed it mathematically. He made springs calculable, designable, predictable. This was the breakthrough that enabled everything after. Once you could calculate how a spring would behave, you could design springs for specific purposes. You could manufacture them to specifications. You could use them reliably in machines and instruments. The Industrial Revolution seized on this. Springs became mass-produced components, essential to countless machines. Railways, factories, firearms, furniture, all incorporated springs. The 20th century made springs ubiquitous. Automobiles alone required dozens per vehicle. Consumer products incorporated springs in every imaginable way. Aerospace, medicine, electronics, springs were everywhere. And now, in the 21st century, springs continue to evolve. New materials, new manufacturing techniques, new applications, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. This is what the story of the spring teaches us, that fundamental discoveries about nature have consequences that compound across centuries. Hooke's insight in 1660 enabled technologies that wouldn't exist for hundreds of years. His law governs devices he never imagined in applications he never conceived of. Science builds. Each generation stands on the shoulders of those before. Hooke built on Ctesibius. Modern engineers build on Hooke. And engineers, centuries from now, will still be building on principles discovered in the 17th century, in ancient Alexandria, in the prehistoric development of the bow. The spring is ancient and modern. It's one of the oldest technologies and one of the most current. It's everywhere and nowhere, invisible except when you look for it. And it works because of physics that have been true since matter first existed. That will be true until the universe ends. Robert Hooke just had the brilliance to see it, measure it, and express it in a way that made it useful forever. The next time you close a car door, think about the spring that makes it latch smoothly. When you click your pen, think about the tiny spring that makes it retract. When you sit on a cushioned chair, think about the springs supporting you. When you drive over a pothole without jarring your spine, think about the springs in your suspension absorbing that impact. These aren't just pieces of metal, they're applications of fundamental physics. They're the descendants of Ctesibius's bronze springs and Hooke's balance springs. They're energy storage devices that require no power, control systems that need no electronics, shock absorbers that never wear out. They work because when you compress or stretch certain materials, they push back with a force proportional to the displacement. It's that simple. It's that profound. And they exist, all of them, from the smallest to the largest, because a sickly, brilliant, contentious man in 17th century England looked at a piece of wire, saw a fundamental pattern in nature, and had the genius to express it mathematically. Robert Hooke died bitter and forgotten. But every spring in the world is his legacy. Every application of elastic energy storage is his monument. Every calculation of a spring constant uses his law. He wanted recognition during his life and didn't get it. But his work will last as long as humans build machines, as long as we need to store energy and absorb shocks and maintain force. That's the invention of the spring. Not one moment, not one inventor, but a principle discovered and refined across millennia. And at the heart of our understanding stands Hooke, the man who finally revealed the law that governs elasticity, who made springs predictable and useful, who enabled an industrial revolution he never lived to see. From ancient bows to modern aerospace, from Ctesibius's bronze to advanced alloys, from intuitive craft to calculated engineering, the spring has been there, storing and releasing energy, making the impossible possible. And it all happens because of a simple, elegant principle. As the extension, so the force. Ut tensio sic vis. That's Hooke's law. That's the spring. That's the invisible force that powers everything.